continuing the series of messages. You get my message yesterday on the screen, Ruben? Excellent, thank you. Put it in the wheel. Just talking about that period of time when you know that God is working everything out for good, but it's not good yet. So what's going on in the meanwhile? So just to kind of recap where we have been. We talked about the fact that what do you do when there's nothing you can really do? You're in a season where things aren't going the way that you thought that they were going to. You're kind of in this limbo land in between. And there can be a season where you kind of wonder where God is. And Paul really talked about the fact that in that season, God is not absent, He is not apathetic or angry. And then we have to also view our adversity as a gift with a purpose and a promise. And then a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the fact that the secret of contentment is to understand that even in the midst of everything, that we can do everything. We can't do it, but God can. And we rest in the fact that we can do thanks to Christ who gives us strength. But today I want to focus in on something a little bit different. What happens? Now, often there's another phrase which I can't use in a public setting. You know that there are certain points in life when things don't go the way that you really wanted them to go. And there are certain times that it really happens. And sometimes it can be over an extended period of time. And so I'm going to share something. I'm always there's a fine line you have as a public speaker of how much personal things you can share. Now, part of the reason why is that these personal things are in front of other people in your life. And so how much information can you share? And so today I want to talk a little bit about some of my own personal circumstance of some of the issues that we had with raising our kids. And so I'm actually glad it's not on screen, but I think we are recording, so I might have to burn the tape or something like that. We say anything that's terrible. It's desperate to fix it. It's a good thing to burn the tape. That's going way back, and more than ever happened. Most of you are aware of the fact that we adopted our three boys. Actually, it's interesting. For a large family, we have 5 kids. You would think, oh, that must mean that it was an easy process. And everything seemed to be excited as far as having kids for us. Which comes back into the story eventually. We actually had Brittany for a fertility program. It was just before we moved up here. So we were having problems having children. And after Brittany was born, the doctors told us that unless there was medical intervention, that there would probably be no way that we could have kids. So we began the process of adoption. Actually, we had even began the process of adoption. We had a failed adoption on a piece of water before we moved up here because we were struggling. And that adoption had been a natural part of our lives because Jen was adopted. And so it was very easy for us to move into the idea that let's just adopt as a way of an option for having kids. And so we even began that process through teaching how to lose children's aid. And this is just a funny aside, not really too many details. We applied through children's aid in Kitchener, and we moved up here, had Brittany, and got connected with children's aid here in town, and adopted Stephen. So before I finally got a letter from Kitchener saying, okay, we could begin the process. So it had been like this rule that there was going to be 8 years down in Kitchener before Stephen Children's Aid would contact us. And it was right on the money, 8 years afterwards. So by that point, we had changed locations, had a child, and adopted the child before that even began. And so when we adopted Stephen, one of the things that they told us was that I knew that he had tested positive for cocaine. And so that was part of the beginnings, which began to we were going to doctors for various reasons, and some kind of things. Generally, naive I was in some ways. Our philosophy is that Jen and I had the idea that generally love would come from. We love these kids, our nurturing of them would compensate for this nature that came with them. I see that naively because nature is a very strong force. And it ended up that the original diagnosis of Buchanan birth was not the most serious thing. The most serious thing that happened was when Stephen was diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. Or as a short name, I might throw it out as we call it, FAS. And almost 3 of our boys began their lives testing positive for cocaine with the fetal alcohol syndrome, which began to show itself more readily. I won't get into I could talk for 3.5 hours to give you a base understanding of fetal alcohol syndrome and what it means. Basically, what it is, it's permanent brain damage. That when a child in the first trimester is exposed to alcohol, a certain part of their brain is damaged by that. And so they have permanent brain damage, and it mainly affects the decision portion of your brain. So that part of your brain that says, you know what, we really want to do that, that's the part that's broken. And so this has been quite a long journey. I want to tell a story. Now, this is a rather, I would call it what I would call a benign, funny story. I have stories which I've told to some people, and the one that really says, you got to write a book about all the stuff that you went through. But again, it's not just my information, it's my kids' information. And so there's some of those stories that probably have to go to the grave with me. Because that get me going. Just get me down to the table. That's probably freaked out. Because they're half scary, half funny, half, anyway, I guess that would make it third. So, because we've been having some problems with the school, there was a lady in town, her name was Elaine Kuzinoff. If you ever bumped into Elaine, Elaine was a wonderful resource for fetal alcohol syndrome. She had adopted a baby, had much of the same experiences that we had had. So Elaine became a professional in FASD. So she was always going to the school and teach teachers on how to work with FASD. So we became an advocate to our school and said, if you're working with kids with FASD, this is a great resource. And so we arranged to adopt a seminar set up at NT Davidson School in order to teach teachers how to best be able to handle this situation. I remember it well because it was on November the 10th. I can't remember the exact year, because the reason I know is because of Remembrance Day was the next day or something. Anyway, so what happened was that we brought this seminar in, and they're teaching the teachers and the principals on how to be able to handle FASD. And what they've discovered is that traditional forms of discipline do not work. Discipline is usually based on consequence-based discipline. If you do something, you punish them as a consequence. But if the consequence doesn't tie in with what they did, they don't understand what just happened. So if you suspend a student from school because they got into a fight, they don't understand why they got suspended. This doesn't make sense to them because it doesn't tie into that instance. So traditional forms of discipline do not work. Okay, so November 11th, I'm doing the Remembrance Day service at the community center, and as I finish up, I get a call from the office of the school. One of my kids got into a fight at school. And so we went into the office and they said, okay, one of the kids got into a fight at school. You need to They're need to be suspended. This is not a first time. So this is just now a multi-day suspension that's going to happen because of this. And I said, hold on a second. You just run a seminar. You were there. You heard what they talk about. Traditional disciplining systems don't work on these kids. So you're suggesting that this is going to do nothing. It's not going to help them. It's not going to help us. It's not going to help anybody. And they said, well, that's the rules, and that's just the way it is. It's just like going not only in the office. One of the classes got invited to go over to the Remembrance Day series. And one of my other sons got into a hot dog eating contest with another kid. As they were getting in, anybody knows anything about hot dogs. Hot dogs are tilting hazard like 101. Okay, so him and this other guy start roasting hot dogs and start thinking, because people believe it, thought it was a great idea to provide hot dogs to them. Which is fine, it's good. One of them choked on a hot dog. Anyway, so acting illusion, they're having to give a Heimlich maneuver to this kid who looks like all over the illusion. An hour later, I'm told I'm not in the office again. And my student number 2 is now being suspended. And it was like, and I gave the same speech, well, you know that the traditional forms of discipline don't work, and it was like, well, these are the rules, and it's just the way it is. Anyway, that's kind of a benign, funny story that happened in our lives. Over the years, some of the stories got a little bit more horrific. And I almost told one that I thought, no, I need to save that one for the book or something like that. And this is something that I wrote. After years of kind of going through the effects of single alcoholism and from a parenting perspective. And I had an instance where things went bad. I will tell you this first of it. This is something, as a parent, this is embarrassing. So, sometimes situations will get really bad, and the police would have to be involved. And so I came home after one of these police, and this is one of those good bad things. I came home, and it's a police officer who actually said, that you know the fact that there's seasoned guys in this world, so much the other thing I was trying to mention. This was one of those things where it was like, there's never quite as much a failure, a reminder of your failure as a parent when you get called to the police, and your kid is doing the police. It's not a good experience. Anyway, in the midst of this, I was going through my journal, and that's so funny. As I was reading through my journal, I said, man, I wish I would have wrote a lot more down of what I went through, because you can learn so much in looking in the rearview mirror and those types of things. And in the middle of this month, this is what I wrote in my journal. I said, it has been a complete onslaught of physical both of person and property, emotional, verbal, and spiritual needs. A perfect storm of broken things, broken hearts, and broken expectations. That's what we read again. And as I reflect on those days, and we're still kind of doing it in time, it's not the same as what I was in the film. But, everyone has this idea, and this is one of these really mixed ones, that you have expectations, but what happens when your life becomes a disaster to a degree? What happens when the things that you thought were going to go in one direction, that the things that you thought would somehow bring fulfillment to you, instead of bringing fulfillment, you feel like failure? And this is a profound thing, and this might be something that resonates with some, that when your kids become a problem to solve instead of people to love. when you go through things like that, you start asking all sorts of different questions. Like this, why did this happen? What, all of this, this is a funny one. Because none of them have problems having kids. And sometimes you wonder, okay, were we not supposed to have any kids? When God's just saying, you have kids? Here you go. Now you got them. And so you start asking yourself the question, like, did I circumvent the will of God? That somehow this was not what He intended? Like, was this something, was I messing with the sovereignty of God? And so somehow, this is why this has happened, and I'm actually being punished because I went against what He was saying? And you'll start asking yourself, well, who's to blame for this? Because we are blame culture. We always want to know who's at fault. That's a horrific thing. What happened in Washington, Washington last week, that accident before 14 years. My first thought was, I want to blame the authority. I want to know who to blame. I want to know who to get mad at. And so we often are kind of blame one another. Whose fault is it? And so when you're struggling, you're not saying, whose fault is this? Is it my fault? Is it somebody else's fault? Who can I blame for all this? And you start asking yourself the question, how do I get out of this? Or is God mad at me? All these different questions. There's an interesting story in Scripture that I want to talk about in the time that we have left. In John chapter 9, you have the Bible, you can follow along. So it answers some of these questions as Jesus has an interaction. So if you have the Bible, let's take a look at John chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. It just says, as you went on, this is Jesus, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples said, and they asked him, Rabbi, who sinned? The man or his parents, that he was born blind? So the question is just that if this guy was born blind, whose fault was it? Is it the guy who was blind? Was that his fault? Was it his parents? Did his parents do something that somehow caused this person to be blind? The disciples saw what they considered to be an inequity. Something is not right, and they wanted to know why there was this inequity that was taking place. And Jesus responds to this by saying in John chapter 9, verse 3, he says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in him. And so here Jesus wants us to learn, he doesn't get distracted into this other discussion about who's to blame. He lets them know that they're focusing on the wrong thing about finding and giving blame. Now, in this specific instance, in this situation, Jesus actually heals this blind man. So the point is that some people will say, okay, so that's the point. It's just like that Jesus is going to miraculously come into this situation, he's going to heal them, and that's going to be the final outcome. I don't think that that's what's being taught here. Sometimes God comes into a situation and miraculously works. Sometimes He doesn't come in that kind of way. He comes in a different way. But the important thing is that in the middle of it, that God is displayed in that situation. That's the important thing. The important thing is to understand that whatever the situation that you're going through, that God is interested that we display Him in the midst of it. That's what He's looking for. Because when you focus on what is wrong, you miss what God is trying to do wrong. When we all we do is focus on everything that's going wrong, the problems that happen, and focus on all these different things, we miss the fact that underneath it all, God is still working, that God is still accomplishing His purposes, that God is still working. And so, our job in the midst of this is to make sure that in our lives, God is displayed no matter what the circumstance. But God is to be displayed. This is important because I know some people that this is their big moment of life. All they can do is focus on the negative things that happen, all the difficulties, all the hardships, all the things that went wrong, always looking for someone to blame because they feel like they're the victim in this, and all they want to do is blame other people for their problems. And they get stuck in this moment, and it is spiritually destructive. It destroys them both body, soul, and mind. God, in us, cannot think of ourselves as victims, but to understand that even in the midst of the difficulty and the hardship, He wants to know that we will display Him and show Him no matter what we go through. God is more, and this is the point, God is more concerned about how He can be on display in your life. Because that's the important thing. There are certain things that I certainly wouldn't want to sign up for. Many of you are going to talk to Mark Chester. Mark was at Lakeshore 2 months. But Mark had kidney failure. And so Mark, for the longest time, had to go through dialysis on a continuous basis. It was so funny. I went to visit. This is going way back. Okay, this is the old Lakeshore people from way back in the day. You remember Laurier Topin? Laurier was a big street player. But I still remember him saying to me, he was talking about, stay away from the battle sports. He had the battle sports was important. And but he was having kidney failure. So I went up to visit him while he was, he was on a dialysis. I just go see him. He was explaining, Pastor, here's where my blood was, and he goes into the machine, and then it comes back, and I can sit down. Well, so that's what I feel that I didn't miss my calling as a personal nurse to people. It was funny because, this is just, I'm sorry. Madeline Kisner was in the room this morning. Madeline was another late for her. She was cancer. She was like, cancer was working for me. She was like, family background and stuff like that. And she was on nursing, and she got to listen. And while she was always in the room, she ripped her IV in. And so, I'm like, oh my. And I'm having this moment, and Maureen comes to the one. She was a nurse. She was like, thank you, Jesus, for sending the nurse. And then I left that situation, and then I went to visit Laurier, and he's on the dialysis machine. So that was my moment for a big movie. Getting back to Mark. Whenever we got together with pastors, Mark would begin to tell stories about what he was going through. Every time he went into this, he would say there was a palatable darkness in these hospital places. Because these were people waiting for blood part transfer. That's the point that they were at. And so this was a dark, dark place. And Mark would go in, and he would have the greatest spiritual conversations with people. And why? Because he is letting God be on display in his situation. This situation, I wouldn't want that. I wouldn't want he had to go through a full kidney transplant. He was in years with dialysis, all these different things, insulin stuff, he was done back stuff. His life was difficult. But everywhere Mark went, God is on display. And he was showing that even in the midst of whatever it is that you're facing, God can be on display, even if it doesn't work out. Because when the universe, anytime you're going through a conflict, there's no guarantee that it's not anything. And so he went into that, and he was able to show God and let God be on display. And in my own situation, with dealing with all these issues, the greatest thing, because I would, you're talking to different people, and I would start talking about some of the choices that they have made, and family would say, well, why don't they just start making better choices? And I would just say, because they've got brain damage! They've got brain damage! That's why! And it's not going to get better. Unless God miraculously moves its mouth. And so, I probably didn't see it most of the time. And in the middle of it, then I'll just actually, this is a funny story. When I learned this from Elaine Kuzma, they said that the statistics for parents with a kid with FAS, the death rate, the most rate for one is 50%. It was 2, but 100% for 2. With 100%, it's like a guaranteed deal. And I said, we have 3 years, so can we go back down again? And maybe we're okay. The important thing was, I'm not saying because I love swimming away. But we determined that we were going to try to follow the system. That was the important thing. Because one's more interested in how we go through things. So something else was so many interested in how things go. Stop trying to blame them. Don't be the victim. Sometimes we get through things like that. But the important thing is, in the middle of it, look for what God is doing. Look for what God is making everything. And in the midst of whatever we do, let God be. And Jesus said, these things are not more power, money, kind of money, and all that. It's about God. So in the midst of whatever it is, Father, we